Chapter 26. Wednesday, early afternoon. Back in her vehicle, Doreen went around the block, parked, then got out, and went to the corner of the road to see what Clara might do next. Doreen watched as Clara walked across to her house and then appeared to be inside for a while. Wondering if she was wrong, Doreen sat and waited. And then, all of a sudden, Clara's vehicle came ripping down the block. She didn't even look in Doreen's direction, and tore around the corner. Doreen hopped back into her car, following Clara as best she could from a distance. Clara appeared to be on a mission, but Doreen had no idea what mission or why. She took lefts and then rights, headed through the main part of town, until they climbed a hill heading toward the Clifton Road area. Doreen frowned, realizing they were heading toward Glenmore. Wasn't that where one of the brothers lived? At least, that's what Nan had said. At that, she wondered, "What are you up to, Clara?" When Clara took a left onto a side street, Doreen deliberately drove past, hoping she would not be seen. The street appeared to curve around, so she waited a little bit before she pulled into the left-hand turn of a mall, and turned around so she was coming back and could approach the same turnoff Clara had taken from the opposite direction. Clara's vehicle was parked in a driveway about 5 houses in. Several other vehicles were parked there. It looked more like a mechanic's dream shop than a residence. Vehicles without wheels were on the side. Another older car had its hood open. The inside of the garage was filled with vehicles. She kept on driving but noted the address. When she got to the end of the block, she wrote down the address and texted it to Mac. Instead of texting her back, he called and asked, "What's with the address?" "I need to know who owns the house." "Why do you want to know?" "Because it's important," she snapped. She parked several houses up and out of the way so she could keep an eye on Clara's car. "Why?" "Because Clara just showed me Crystal's bedroom in her husband's house and in her home. I found a picture of Crystal, laughing and having a grand old time with Mary, Guido, and Jose," she said impatiently. Clara kind of freaked. "Next thing I know, she's driven straight out to Glenmore, and she's at that address I gave you. Now you tell me that's not Guido's address." "I want you to go straight home," he said, his voice tight and hard. "Do not drive past that house. Do you hear me?" "Meaning it is his, right?" "Yes," he said. "I'll send a cop to drive past the house. You go home. Do not pass them again. If they have any idea you followed her," he said, "they'll come after you. These people are not to be trifled with." "Then you better get here and get after them before they come after me," she said coolly. "I told you before. Most of these cases involve people who don't want to talk. I've just shaken something loose, whether it was intentional or not." That picture brought up all kinds of shit for Clara. Was she angry? Was she worried? I think she was in shock. She said she didn't know who the men were. Then she suddenly recognized them. But if Clara knew them, why would she be upset? Doreen noticed activity at the house. Somebody's having a fight in the driveway. It's a large man. I can't really see who it is, but he's got his arm pointing at Clara, yelling at her to get the hell out. And just like that, she watched Clara get into her vehicle, reverse onto the road, and take off. "Now she's leaving," Doreen said. "And he's not happy that she showed up in the first place. So maybe she thinks they're involved? Maybe, or maybe they're all involved, and he's afraid she's bringing the cops down on them. You do like to get yourself in trouble, don't you?" Max said with a heavy sigh. "Go straight home. Don't stop anywhere." "I don't need to," she said cheerfully. "I already went to the bank and also picked up groceries." "You can cook pork chops, can't you?" "Of course I can cook pork chops," he said, but his voice was distracted. "Good, then that's what you'll cook Friday night. I'm leaving now." She ended her call, turned her engine on, and rather than drive past the house, she pulled a U-turn and headed up and around the block. It didn't lead back onto the main road, but did take her several blocks down below. She retraced her steps, but it was hard to figure out exactly where she was. It took longer to get home than she had planned, but by the time she finally pulled into her driveway, she was more than grateful to be home. Muggs was barking at the front door already. She unlocked the door and let Muggs out, taking a moment to cuddle him. "I know, Muggs. I hardly ever leave you alone anymore, do I?" She pushed inside with the animals, all three of them talking to her one way or another, as she spent a few minutes cuddling everybody before closing her front door. "You guys are something else. Who knew you would be such cuddle bums?" When they were all calmed down, she headed to the kitchen, got out the treats, and gave everybody a few. She opened the kitchen door, propped it open, and then walked back inside to put on the tea kettle, while she put up the rest of her groceries, mainly the canned goods in the pantry. Her mind was buzzing with what she'd seen. Guido definitely had something to do with this, but Doreen didn't know what and how much, if anything, did Clara have to do with it. And why didn't Clara know anything about Guido in that photograph? Did Mary make a point of having her family meet Crystal? And maybe Clara didn't want them to. Doreen wasn't exactly sure what was going on, but her mind wouldn't let it go. She put away the last of the groceries while the tea water boiled. Then she made a cup and sat out on the deck at the small table and chair. She had a notepad beside her, and her laptop in front of her. The light was dim, but she could still see some things. She jotted down the notes of what she'd seen, the house address, Clara's license plate, and she'd also grabbed the type of car and the time of day when she had arrived at Guido's house. When her doorbell rang, she groaned, shut the laptop, and stood up, walking to the front door. When she opened it, she stared in surprise at Clara. Only it wasn't just Clara, it was a very angry, seething Clara. Doreen raised her eyebrows and asked, "What's the matter?" "You followed me," she snapped. "Yes, I did," Doreen said, calmly crossing her arms over her chest. She leaned against the doorway. "You went straight to Guido's house?" "Guido, who you said you didn't know and didn't recognize in the picture." Clara's face worked into a shocked expression. "How did you know that's Guido's house?" "It's pretty easy to tell," Doreen said, "and thanks for confirming it." Clara's temper spiked. She glared at Doreen, her fingers clenching and unclenching. "Why are you so angry?" Doreen asked. She eyed the woman carefully. Muggs was sniffing around her ankles, but he wasn't barking. Normally, if he didn't like somebody, he growled and barked. But at this point, Muggs seemed to be unconcerned. Then again, he'd been locked up all morning. Maybe this was his retaliation for Doreen leaving him, this failure to growl at her enemies. Muggs's reaction to Clara made no sense in many ways. But she didn't dare take her eyes off Clara. She'd seen way too many women strike out when Doreen turned her back. And then, all of a sudden, Clara seemed to lose all the stuffing inside her, and tears welled up in her eyes. She wiped them and whispered, "I'm so exhausted. I just want this shit over with." "And what shit is that?" Doreen asked, almost quivering as she got the words out. "I want my daughter back. And yet, I wonder if you wanted your daughter when she was there with you for the first 8 years of her life," she said, knowing she was being deliberately aggressive and hurtful. It wasn't that she wanted to hurt this woman, but she needed the truth. "You haven't spoken the truth since this all began. How do you expect anybody to find answers when you start with lies?" Clara sagged against the porch railing. "I don't understand how you know that," she cried softly. "They weren't major lies." "Any lie hinders the truth, Clara," Doreen said with emphasis, watching as now Goliath came out and wrapped his way through Clara's legs. Clara didn't seem to notice. Doreen didn't know what the animals were up to, but 2 of them were here now. She raised her gaze to Clara's face. One small lie throws everybody into a different direction, and it wasn't just one small lie, was it? Clara shook her head. A heavy sigh came up from her chest as if a weight had been released. "No," she admitted. "It wasn't just one small lie. It was lots of them. I should probably go to the cops and change my statement. You should, especially if you ever want to find your daughter, dead or alive. How could she be alive? Clara asked. After all this time especially. I don't know, Doreen said, because I haven't heard your current version yet. Why don't you start with that? Clara nodded. I was supposed to look after her, she said. Crystal was supposed to be at my house. She wasn't supposed to be at Eric's house. Eric and Mary were fighting, and Crystal didn't want to go over there on her scheduled days, and I was fighting with Eric to let Crystal stay with me. But Eric adored her, and he didn't want to lose that time he had with her. He was always fighting with Mary over Crystal's visits. So that night when she went missing, she wasn't even supposed to be in Eric's house? Doreen asked for confirmation. She frowned because that of course changed everything. If she wasn't supposed to be there, then who would actually know she was there? No, she wasn't, Clara said, rubbing her face. But my boyfriend was at my house too, and Crystal didn't like him. As far as I can tell, she snuck out during the night and went over to Eric's. Without you knowing? Doreen was hard-pressed to keep the shock from her voice. She couldn't imagine an 8-year-old deliberately sneaking out of the house without her mother knowing, and then sneaking into her father's house without him knowing. Exactly, Clara said. Do you think I'm not racked with guilt over that? Crystal hated Tom, and I didn't listen to her. I was so desperate to feel wanted, to be needed, that I was happy to hook up with him. And what if he did something to Crystal that made her not want anything to do with him? Doreen asked. Did you ever check him out, like even online or maybe with an official background check? Did you ever look to see if he was eyeing your daughter a little too carefully, a little too closely? Clara shook her head. I don't think he would have had time, she said. Honestly, we were going at it like rabbits constantly. That would have been equally uncomfortable for your daughter, Doreen said in a dry tone. And hardly appropriate conduct around a child. We didn't have sex when she was here. Then she stopped, shrugged and said, okay, well, we might have. But we would have been in our bedroom. Doreen just gave her a flat stare. Clara raised her hands, palms up. I was still reeling from the separation. I was in a very bad space. Which then meant that little Crystal was also in a bad space. Because not only were her parents separating and her whole world crumbling, but her father had a new partner who didn't like her, and you had a new partner who maybe liked her too much, Doreen said. How am I doing so far? You're doing fine except for that bit about my boyfriend, Clara said, her tone turning stiff. But Crystal still wouldn't have done anything to hurt me. She was probably in survival mode, Doreen said. Looking at what she needed to do for herself. If she wasn't comfortable at either home, she needed to find another place to go. But that makes it sound like she was part of this whole plot to disappear, Clara protested. And that's not likely. Why is that? Because she was only 8, for God's sake, Clara cried out. Are you sure there weren't any family members she really enjoyed being with, or who promised a different lifestyle? I don't think any of the family would have taken her into their bosom without telling the cops, Clara said. She stared at Doreen. Surely. Particularly after she disappeared. But what if they felt they were helping her? What if they didn't like her family situation, and what she was telling them, whether true or not, made it sound like her home life was terrible? Well, then they would have called the cops. Doreen let that silence lengthen. Were the cops ever called on you? She asked gently. Clara, shut up. Doreen nodded to herself. So was it domestic violence between you and your husband, or between you and your boyfriend? At this, Doreen could see Clara getting mad again. Right, Doreen said with a wave of her hand. Both. It's not that the men were abusive. You were. How often did you hit your daughter? Clara stiffened indignantly. Remember all those little white lies? Doreen asked. Remember how you weren't going to tell them anymore? And you would clear the air. I didn't say I ever abused her though, Clara protested. You're putting words in my mouth. Maybe and maybe not, Doreen said. Because all you're doing is lying, so you haven't yet spoken the truth. Okay, look. So I used to get mad, particularly during the divorce, and it got really ugly a few times. I might have hit her, but I didn't really hurt her. I think it's a case of you didn't mean to. As soon as you hit a child, they perceive that pain as punishment, and it also confuses the hell out of them, she said. None of that matters, Clara said. How do you figure that? Doreen asked. Because she still couldn't have left on her own, Clara said. Remember. She was only 8. Maybe not, Doreen said. But the police have been looking for somebody who stole her away from you. I wonder if anybody was looking to see who might have helped her escape. At that, Clara gave Doreen a haunted look and headed down the porch steps and onto the driveway. She raced to her car, backed out of the driveway, and ripped off so fast and at such a high speed that Doreen was afraid for Clara's well-being. That went well, she said. Not. Almost immediately as she still stood here, Mac drove into the cul-de-sac, came into her driveway, and parked. He got out, looked behind in the direction the other car went, then turned back toward Doreen. She crossed her arms again and smiled at him. Hey, she said. Was that Clara? It so was Clara, a very upset Clara, she admitted. Instead of milling around his feet, this time Muggs and Goliath were jumping up, looking for attention from Mac. He crouched down so Goliath could hop up on his lap and Muggs could sniff his face. You and this menagerie, he said. Well, Thaddeus is on the railing here waiting for you too, she said, chuckling. Just then Thaddeus opened his mouth and said, Clara was here. Clara was here. She glared at him. You know that I didn't lie about that. I did tell Mac she was here. Thaddeus shot her a look and squawked, Clara was here. Clara was here. She glared at Mac, who was hiding a smile. I didn't lie, did I? No, you didn't, he said, chuckling. Thank you for that. He stood now, walking toward her. Besides, what's the point, she asked. This bird will call me a liar, every time. Liar, liar. Liar, liar. Liar, liar. Mac gently stroked Thaddeus's chest and then his cheek. Thaddeus took advantage, hopped up onto the back of his hand, and walked his way up to Mac's shoulder. There he gently rubbed his beak against Mac's cheek. Mac chuckled. This is the first time he's ever done this. Good, she said. That's what he does with the people who love him. She turned on her heels and walked inside with both Muggs and Goliath following. Mac stepped inside, looked around and said, Wow, this looks different. Not different enough. I've been stacking stuff inside the garage. I still have stacks here to go to Wendy's, and it seems like I never quite get ahead, she muttered. Got time for coffee? She shot him a look. You're lucky I just bought some. I was out. Then I am lucky, he said cheerfully. So did you drive past Guido's house? I did, he said, but driving past his house doesn't tell me anything. Can you pull the records to see if there's been any domestic violence reports for that household, or who lives there, what kind of activity occurs there? Hey, check to see if that area is zoned for both residential and commercial use. It's a house owned by a family, he said, frowning. I'll check zoning requirements. Family? She asked, startled. Guido is married? His mom lives there, I believe. At least she lives there sometimes. She's Mexican and they often come back and forth. But that wouldn't be on the police records, would it? She asked, looking at him intently. He chuckled and shook his head. No. There were a couple complaints by the neighbors, and it was noted how many people were living there at the time that the officer came to check it out. Interesting, she said. Actually fascinating, but hey, who knows, right? She made coffee while he watched, and he said, "You appear to be very upset." What did Clara say? She said she lied, Doreen said. She lied to the police 10 years ago. About what? He asked, his voice sharp. Crystal wasn't supposed to be at her husband's house that night. She was supposed to be at home with Clara. Mac slowly straightened from where he'd been leaning against the kitchen doorway. What? Exactly. And a few other incidents she lied about, Doreen said, and then she filled him in on the conversation she'd had with Clara. That changes a lot of things, Mac said. If it changes anything, it's huge. You can't build a case based on lies, but of course everybody lies, as I'm finding out. True. I want to talk to her, he said, his voice harsh. She did say she would talk to the police and update her statement, right? Yes. Unless she changes her mind. And she better have a damn good reason why she didn't do it back then. I highly suspect she was afraid of getting charged for child abuse, Doreen said. The real question? Did Crystal leave on her own, or did she have help, or was she taken against her will? Mac wasn't looking very happy with any of the options. For 10 years, he said, we've been going on one assumption. Which is why it's so important that we now get an updated statement from Clara, Doreen admitted. Apparently Eric and Mary aren't in town this week, and Clara's still close enough to them that she looks after the house while they're gone. Mac tapped his fingers on his arm as he thought about it. Do you know when they're coming back? She shook her head. No, but probably before the weekend. Today is Wednesday, he said quietly. So maybe tomorrow or Friday? I also don't know where they've gone. For all I know, that's another lie. Maybe I'll have a little visit with Clara. He backed out of the house, heading for the front door. What about coffee? She asked. Hold on, he said. I'll be right back. And he disappeared.